Hello everyone, this is David Suess with Practical Catholic. This is a continuation of fake people. Last time I went over the importance of good self-esteem and this lack of self-consciousness of who we are and living an intentional life can cause people to become fake. This is because they are brought into a society that encourages a certain behavior and encourages them for their talents. In essence, a society that creates robots. It does not emphasize contemplation and meditation on who we are and what are we made for, and what does God want us to be. Great saints were never fake and knew what they were. Today's episode continues our discussion of the fake people syndrome, but how Catholicism seems to facilitate this fake behavior. Many Catholics will say that Catholics are so fake and not real, and many feel as though that Catholic Church is nothing more than a bunch of rules to make us robots.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Suess. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins back in boot camp. As I mentioned before in the past, boot camp is broken down into 3 phases. And in part 2, or phase 2, is typically 2 weeks of mess duty. So it's rifle range, and then the other half of phase 2 is mess duty. And that's most of the platoon will do, work in the kitchen, or what we call the mess. They will serve the food, they will clean the pots and everything. But I was one of very few that didn't have to do that. I was chosen with another recruit of mine to go and help Marines clean up the area. And this was a pretty, comparatively speaking, it was a pretty easy job. We were a gunnery sergeant who was not a drill instructor, was in charge of us, and he treated us almost like Marines. Because he didn't have the full authority of a drill instructor. He only had an authority of a gunny. So the recruit that I was with, though, was one of my favorite recruits in my platoon. I would have went to combat. If I ever wanted to go to combat, he would be the recruit that I would want to be there with me. There was something about him that just made him so genuine, so free, and fearless. It was really amazing because I always wanted to be a very good Marine. I always wanted to be the top-notch Marine. And so I read everything about being a good Marine that I failed to see to be who I am, And this recruit never failed to forget who he was, and that what he was actually made him a better Marine than me trying to be a good Marine, trying to follow the rules, trying to do everything that seems to be the best way of becoming a good Marine. So what happened was that we went, the gunny and I the gunny had us go and clean up a certain area where we knew recruits were training. And one of the things that they would do in training was they would collect all the MREs and they would just throw it in the garbage can. We weren't allowed to eat any of the candy or the chocolates that came with the MREs. So we're cleaning this area, and we know that the garbage can has nothing but chocolate and candy in it from the MREs. So my buddy says to me, he says, why don't we sneak over there and go in the garbage can and grab some candy and chocolate. Now, we haven't had chocolate in now phase 2 is probably about 6-7 weeks inside, so we haven't had any kind of candy, sweets, not even soda, nothing. It's all basically water, juice, or milk. And so I was kind of dying for some chocolate, and I said to him, no, we can't do that. We're going to get into deep trouble if we do that. And he said, no, we'll just low crawl and go over there and climb into the garbage can and get some candy. And I told him, I said, no way, we're going to get into deep trouble if we do that. So lo and behold, he starts low crawling over to the garbage can, and he climbs into the garbage. It's one of those big garbage bins that, the big trucks pick up and stuff. And he climbs in there, and you hear him just rummaging through, or, like almost like a raccoon, and opening it up, and all of a sudden he just pops up out of the garbage can and goes, "I found it," and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, he just found all the chocolate." So I'm thinking to myself, "Wow, should I join him or should I just stay away because he can get in trouble?" So I decided to join him. So I crawled over there, climbed in, and we found at least 20 pieces of chocolate. They're small little chocolate bars. And we ate probably most of it, and then put it away, and then climbed out. And we were smiling and laughing and joking around. We never got caught, never got in trouble. Nothing ever happened. The reason why I share this was because a lot of times we want to be the best and we want to be great at what we do, but always at the disregard of what naturally needs to be us. We are the ones who put fences around ourselves. We are the ones that limit ourselves. We are the ones that short circuit ourselves. And that's not what God wants us to do. God gave us only 10 commandments. Out of all the things, 10 commandments. It is only Satan that limits us. I want to go back to Genesis, and this exemplifies how Satan limits us. If we look at Genesis, and we notice that Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden, okay, in this great, beautiful paradise, and God says to Adam and Eve, "Eat everything here in this paradise, in this place, everything except for one thing, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." There was only one commandment, okay, one negative commandment that Adam and Eve had to follow. And there was only one thing that they could not eat, but there was everything else that you could eat. Imagine that. And so through Satan and through pride, he convinced Adam and Eve that they could not eat everything in that garden, which is true. See, Satan, I'm a firm believer that Satan tells the truth. He doesn't lie. He actually tells the truth, but they're half-truths, right? He says to them, "You cannot eat everything in this garden, can you?" Listen to that with those words. It's more prideful if you say, "Oh, I can't eat everything." Well, that's true. You can't. They couldn't eat everything in that in Eden, but they could practically eat everything except for one item. That's the other half of the truth. And so Satan, wants to use the truth to deceive us, and that's what he does. He uses the truth to do that. And so that's what Satan does. He limits us and says, "Oh, God gave us these 10 commandments. That means you can't do anything." And so we bottle ourselves up like we're just, these little robots in the rest of our lives. So today's episode, we're going to talk about, how Catholicism makes us fake. And in some cases, all religions in some sense makes us fake, okay? Especially if we are living, we're trying to be the best we can rather than being who we are, which is a child of God, and expressing everything through that genuineness that we have. In the last episode, episode 33, I interjected an interview with David Sanborn. David Sanborn was a convert from Protestantism. And the one thing that I hope that you understand from that interview, which I really, if you haven't listened to that episode, listen to it, because the neat thing about David Sanborn is that he's genuine. He is genuine. He's like that recruit when I was in the Marine Corps. He was genuine, he's fearless, and there's a sense of freedom that he has in that interview that expresses itself in its beauty. And if you ever get the chance to talk to him, you can see that Catholicism made him even more free, even more fearless, even more genuine. And so I urge you to listen to episode 33 with the interview with David Sanborn to really understand this genuineness. I remember listening to Scott Hahn for the first time when I was, going through my reversion. And I also noticed how genuine he was, how fearless he was, and how free he was as well. It's amazing how, in some sense, the Protestant ideology of once saved, always saved, has a kind of a freeing aspect of it. Not that I believe in that theology, but there is a freedom into it in a sense that they can become who they want to be and what God calls them to be. Okay? Because real Christianity and Catholicism brings freedom and genuineness, not fake. Okay? But for some odd reason, a lot of Catholics become fake people with poor self-esteem. And today's topic is going to give some reasons why this happens. Okay? So past episodes, we talked about the importance of self-esteem. All right, so we're not going to go over that. And if you go to episode 32, I talk about the failed self-esteem pattern. There's a pattern that basically children are brought up in a society that tells them how they should be, rather than being what they are called to be and what they are, which is a child of God. We express ourselves as a child of God. But let's talk more specifically what happens to Catholics and why there's a cause of poor self-esteem as well as a fakeness in our society. I think, what's one of the detrimental things about the Catholic Church, especially if you don't really study theology and read the Bible, and really, really understand the Bible, is that there's a lot of sound bites, a lot of sound bites that is really, really awkward, and it makes people really misunderstand. And part of those sound bites are causes of it. Even the new Mass, especially with the lectionary and everything. And I love the lectionary. I love it because you do read the Bible. There's more biblical stuff in it than even the extraordinary form. But I will say though, where there's also a detriment, it's a double-edged sword, is that there's more sound bites in the ordinary form than in the extraordinary form, because the extraordinary form kind of focuses on, few really major topics, and they kind of express it in its fullness. You get to understand that. But because of the lectionary and because there's different readings and everything else, you get more sound bites. And the detriment about sound bites is that you don't get the full story. Okay. Now, a person who's very steeped in the Bible or into the full understanding of theology, listening to these sound bites are wonderful and they're great. But most people who aren't in that level, those sound bites become very, very misleading and become very, very misleading, basically. So the first misleading thing is a misunderstanding of saints, and that cause low self-esteem. If you read a lot of saints, they always talk about, I'm a sinner, I'm nothing, I must do penance, etc., etc. They don't boast, they don't brag, and that is really, really overemphasized to the point to the detriment of people who listen to these sound bites. Okay, so we have this really big misunderstanding that saints just has low self-esteem. That they didn't care about themselves, that they had low self-esteem, and that all such boasting is evil. Even if you listen to St. James, listen to this St. James. It's James chapter 4, verse 16. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. I mean, you read that, and that could be a soundbite right there in the liturgical season. And now people think, oh my goodness, if I boast, I must be an arrogant person. And that's not it, okay? One of the things we have to understand is that saints actually had a very good self-esteem. And the reason why was because they based their saintliness in being a child of God, based off of their baptismal regeneration that occurred at baptism, reinforced in confirmation. That's the central. And now they're living out that life. When you kind of have to understand that when they're saying that they are a nothing, in reality, we are nothing, okay? But we are something because God made us a child of God, okay? There is nothing that we could have done, and we are worms. But here's the kicker. We have been made a child of God. And once that happened, our value increased, okay? The value of our property just increased because we now became a child of God. And there was nothing that we did. And that's what the saints are saying. We are nothing. How could a great God like that make us into a child of God? And that is because of love. Because he loves us, okay? He loves us. And so it's when we get these sound bites of these great saints that say, I'm a sinner or I'm a nothing or whatever, yes, that's true. But the other aspect of it, the other half of the story is that we are nothing, but we became something, okay? I am a sinner, but I became a saint when I was baptized. I continue that sanctity through confession, and my road to perfection. So it's this overemphasis on this, pre kind of baptism or falling into sin kind of a thing, when we have to point ourselves and say, no, we are a child of God. And let me boast in that. Let me boast in that I'm a child of God, and now I can express that. Okay? So martyrs' death is worthless if their life has no worth. Martyrs are not suicidal. Okay? Remember that. Okay? All the martyrs that died, they didn't die because they were suicidal maniacs. They weren't kamikazes, or bonsai attacks. They truly loved their life because they knew they were a child of God. But because they loved God more, the value of their sacrifice of their life is worth a lot, okay? Suffering and penance, okay? All right? If we just suffered, then what would suffering and penance be worth? Okay? Nothing. But it's worth a lot because we're worth a lot. Our penance and our suffering is worth a lot because we are worth a lot. Okay? That's what it is. What's worth more? A sacrifice by a servant or sacrifice made by your son or your daughter? Okay? What's worth more? A sacrifice made by my employee. Now, I hire them, let's say, and I'm an employee, and they say, oh, I stayed up all night to make, to do this, proposal for this sales project. That's great. And I would be very proud of them. That's great. But if my son said to me, Dad, I stayed up all night to take care of my sister because she was sick, what has more worth? My son. Okay? So it is knowing that we're a child of God that our suffering and our penance is worth a lot. Okay? Because we are no longer a servant. We are no longer a slave. We are a child of God, and all of our sufferings and penance means that much more to God, the Father, and Our Lady than than a servant does. Okay? Dying for another person is meaningless if you don't appreciate yourself. Okay? Again, it goes back to the idea that we're not suicidal maniacs. We love ourselves, and we want to give ourselves to another. Okay? So this false idea of misunderstanding of saints, low self-esteem, okay? The reason why great saints do that is to emphasize and show how loving God is. Because love, the definition of love is basically God coming down to us when he does not need to. Okay? When we were enemies and God came down to us. Okay? He's self-donating to us, and he's saying that. And that's why the great saints are saying how lowly they are. I am nothing. I'm a sinner. To emphasize how much love God has for us. Because he was able to take someone like I am, a sinner, which is nothing. I am a worm. But then elevate me to be his child. That's what the saints are saying. So when we just emphasize the sinner part and the nothing part, then we're really being, Satan is just misleading us and deceiving us and giving us half-truths. Because the full truth is we are nothing, but in God's eyes, we are everything. And so because of that, we have great worth. And our sufferings and our penance and our martyrdoms are great. Okay? The second is this overemphasis in suffering. Okay? So for some odd reason, suffering is equated to Catholicism, right? That if you have somehow if you're Catholic, if you're a real Catholic, you'll suffer, right? You'll really, really, really suffer if you're a Catholic. I remember listening to a homily one time, and a priest said, once you become a Catholic, once you become a fully, good Christian, you're gonna suffer. And I was like, wow, if you're trying to attract people to convert to the Catholic Church, this is not the way to do it, okay? That would be like saying, if you want to go to Disneyland, you're going to have to suffer to go through it. Well, if that's the case, then who would want to go to Disneyland, right? So, but this idea that we suffer, that's what it is. And I've seen, Catholics who are very fake, who just have this like, down and trodden look. That's like, oh yeah, I'm just this suffering soul, woe is me kind of Eeyore kind of thing. And that is not the case, because here's the thing. Catholicism does not have a monopoly on suffering. And I say this often. It does not have a monopoly on suffering. I was just reading an article in the news about a woman who was burned alive because she was reporting a sexual harassment case. And this was in, I believe it was in Malaysia or Indonesia, in the, predominantly Muslim country. She's not Catholic. She's not Christian. She's Muslim. Do you think she didn't suffer? Do you think all the Indians that lived in Calcutta, where Mother Teresa was helping these literally dying people out in the streets that were just nothing but skin and bones, and we're not talking about 100 of these people. We're talking like tens, I would even say millions of Calcutta people. Do you think they're not suffering and they were not Christians? Okay. Do you think the people of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, all those people who are fighting over there, do you think they're not suffering? Do you think the people in China or North Korea who are atheists, do you think they're not suffering? I can guarantee you they're suffering a lot more, 1,000 more than we are here in America. More than I am. And I'm Catholic. I'm Christian. So we cannot say that we are, to suffer is to be Catholic. If you're Catholic, you're going to suffer. I can tell you right now, if that's the case, then the people in Iraq and Afghanistan, the people in North Korea, and the people in, Calcutta must be the most devout Catholics out there. But that is not the case. The value of suffering in Catholicism is not the suffering itself. Okay? It's not the suffering itself. The value that that Catholicism brings to suffering is the meaning of suffering. That's the difference. Okay? It doesn't matter what suffering you go through. Okay? What matters the most is that Catholicism is the only religion that provides meaning to suffering because it's redemptive suffering. And because it gives us meaning, we can then, all right, have joy in suffering. Yes, joy in suffering. We're the only religion that can actually enjoy suffering, all right? There should be a book called The Joy of Suffering, right? Because we know what the meaning of suffering is. No other religion has that. Okay? That's the differentiator. Okay? It's not the suffering itself. Okay? It's not because someone is starving here or someone is, not having the proper money to support their family. No. The differentiator is that we as Catholics know what the meaning of suffering is all about. And because of that, we can then find joy in suffering. Joy. So that for those people who have the sourpusses and say, I'm suffering because, because I'm a Catholic, and they have a sourpuss, then they really don't know what the true meaning of suffering is in the Catholic Church. And that is that we have meaning, and because we have meaning, we can joy in suffering. And when we have joy in suffering, we actually want more suffering. Okay? I was at a eulogy at a friend of mine's funeral who if he's not in heaven, I don't know who will be. He was a wonderful man, and his grandson, actually multiple of his grandchildren did the eulogy, and they gave different flavors of who he was. But the one grandson who emphasized his faith, it was so beautiful. He said, my grandfather suffered a lot throughout his years, and he never, ever prayed to die or to leave. And the reason why he wanted to continue to live was because he wanted to suffer for all the souls there. He enjoyed suffering. And because he knew there was a purpose of his suffering, he was bedridden. I knew him for only about 10 years. And he was bedridden all the time that I knew him. And he was suffering. But he had this sense of joy. And his grandson pointed out that he actually wanted to suffer to save souls. He did not want to waste a single ounce of suffering to lose a soul. So that's the true. So if you're going to be this sourpuss suffering person, then in reality, you don't know what the meaning of suffering is all about. And so there is no joy, and thus you're probably, in a sense, fake. Okay? And some Catholics, I've seen them even identify themselves with suffering, as if I must be a great Catholic or the best Catholic because I am suffering, okay? Become, a lot of times Catholics, we sometimes think of suffering as almost like a game, and those types of things. And I can tell you, and I'll be quite frank with you, I've seen people who think that suffering is these minute little things that it's amazing. I remember one time I was working with other people on a day with Mary, and someone forgot something or someone, and the person who was in charge was like, "Oh my goodness, I am deeply suffering." And I'm looking at it going, oh my goodness, it's just, that's part of life. That's what happens, right? So suffering is very relative. A lot of the suffering here is our own self-doing and self-inflicted suffering. But suffice it to say that there are Catholics out there who really put on this show of suffering that is really fake. If you are truly understanding what suffering is all about in the Catholic Church and you're a child of God, you'd be suffering with joy. Okay? It's not to say that you will like the suffering. It just means that there is a sense of purpose behind it. And now, because of that purpose, it gives you a sense of joy. Okay? The third is they were taught never to think highly of themselves. Only how bad they are. I know a lot of times, and this happened to me even growing up in my own life, there was a lot of times where, I was a little bit boastful, and I said, hey, people would say, oh, you're really good at football or really good at wrestling. And I'd be like, yeah, I am. And then, someone who's kind of devoutly Catholic would say, oh, you're just boasting. You're being arrogant. And at that time, it was just an innocent little like, well, thank you kind of a thing. I think, if I had to do it over again, I would say, yes, thank you for this great compliment, but it's all for the glory of God. But we're taught never to think highly of ourselves and how bad we are. In the olden days, you weren't allowed to compliment someone. Oh, how great you are. But you know what? We actually have to acknowledge, okay, our greatness, things that we are great, believe it or not, okay? It's actually, believe it or not, it's against justice if we do not do two things: acknowledge our great talents and identify them that it is the Lord. Because it is God who gave us these talents. And so God wants us, the world, to acknowledge our great talents, but then he wants us to acknowledge that it is God. So I'm going to give you a couple of things to ruminate on, right? If we were not to think highly of ourselves, let's look at the Magnificat. The Magnificat, which is Our Lady, humble Mary, our mother. She says, my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. Okay, she's associating her soul and saying, my soul is going to proclaim how great the Lord is. She's kind of boasting, right? From this day, all generations will call me blessed. Okay? So imagine if I walked around and I said to people, you know what? From this day on, everyone, every generation, everyone from now on is going to call me blessed. What do you think people would say? They would think, oh my goodness, you're a little boastful right there. All right? And listen to this. The Almighty has done great things for me. Yeah, God has done great things for me. Okay? Imagine if I walked around and I said to people, you know what? From this generation, everyone's going to call me blessed from this day on. And by the way, because God has done great things for me. What great things has he done for you? Right? So the point I'm getting at is, here's humble Mary, and she is boasting. But notice that her boasting is not about herself. It's about God. It's about, everything is pointing to God. That is true justice. Acknowledging what's going to happen, acknowledging the greatness, but then pointing it back to God. That's what we have to do. So a lot of times, again, in these sound bites that Catholics get, we hear if someone says, you shouldn't boast, you're not a great football player. If you say that, you're boasting. That's the wrong thing to say. What we should encourage kids to say is, something like, if let's say they play the piano very nicely, and they say, yes, thank you, I do play the piano very nicely. We should encourage them to say, yes, I do play the piano very nicely, but it's by the, by God's will or by God giving me this talent, okay? It's God who gave me these talents, all right? So true justice will say, acknowledge the great attribute, the great talent that God has given you, but then attribute it back to God. That's what true justice is. So if you have false humility, if you actually say, oh, no, I'm not really good at the piano, or I'm not really good at football, or I'm not really good at, computers or whatever, as long as you truly are good at what you say you are, that you're not lying, then what happens when you have this false humility is you're actually doing an unjust act towards God. You're actually doing an unjust act. You're basically hiding your talents and the talents that God has given you, and you're not glorifying God through those talents, and that's an unjust act. And that unjust act literally is a sin, okay? So when, I understand in the olden days they used to chastise you for saying things like that, but in reality, what you want to do is point out that, yes, it is, I did play the piano well, I played football well, or I'm a great, I'm good at, business, but always pointing to, but that's what God has given me. That's the talent that God has given me. And always understand that that is a talent that God giveth, and he can take it away. The next is this idea, and it kind of segues into this other idea of false humility. Number 4. We have this idea of false humility where we try to play down who we are. And this false humility, again, goes back into that's a really an injustice to God, okay? But then the opposite also occurs when false humility is overblown, right? Some people get so aggravated about this false humility, and false humility is fake. It is totally, totally fake, okay? Do you ever see the person, where they say, you're really good at the piano, and they're like, oh, no, I'm not, I'm not really that good, and meanwhile, they're just sucking it up because people are saying good things. That's really wrong, okay? But then you got people who do the opposite, which they're just, because they hate this false humility, they go and they boast, and they say, oh, yeah, I am really good at football, and it's me, right? Because they want to act timid like that false, humble person, okay? So truth and justice versus false humility, okay? And that's what we have to understand. Number 5, confusing confidence with assertiveness with self-esteem. A lot of times people confuse assertiveness with self-esteem, all right? What's the difference, right? Assertiveness is more about, I know who I am, and I'm not embarrassed of my weaknesses. I'm not embarrassed of my strengths, and we want to be assertive. Confidence is when you are able to do a certain thing very well, okay? And people confuse confidence with assertiveness. Let's say, for example, I'm very good at tennis, or let's say I'm good at business, but once you take me out of the realm of tennis or the business world, I become unconfident and I'm not assertive, and I feel like a fish out of water, and now I clam up. So a lot of times people confuse the two, okay? So I remember one time I was informed in the Marines, and a colonel once said to me, he says, I'm really good at being a colonel in the Marines, but I'm horrible at being a father, okay? And that's what happens, An assertive person will be good everywhere because they're just, they have good self-esteem. Whether they are bad at being a father, they'll try to work at becoming a better father, right? And say, you know what, I failed, but let me see if I can do better, right? Just like when I was a Marine, I failed, and now I want to be a better Marine. So confidence doesn't mean that you're assertive. It just means that you're good at the thing that you're confident about, whether it's at work or whether it's anything. But assertiveness is what we really want to go after, to be this assertive person with good self-esteem based off of being a child of God. The next is fear. Okay, many Catholics I find are very fearful. I don't know if it's partly because of this idea of hell and heaven, or because there's so many rules and we're afraid of breaking the rules. But this is probably the biggest cause of fakeness, is that a lot of Catholics are afraid, and so they feel like they're boxed in. They have to behave a certain. They emphasize more of the behavior as opposed to who they really are. Okay, and that fear of breaking the behavior is what they're worried about, as opposed to doing things because of who they are. Fear, I'll give you an example, is that, when we are trying to become the best Catholic, we think that following a recipe, or we think that behaving a certain way is what it means to be a good Catholic. And that is not the case. Okay? Behavior does not make the person. Now, it helps out, but it doesn't make the person. The person makes who they are, and then they behave that way. Okay? So let's give an example. A babysitter. Okay? A babysitter might do everything that a mother might do. Change the diaper, feed the baby, play with the baby, sleep with the baby, do everything. But the babysitter is not the mother. Okay? The babysitter will never be the mother. Okay? So that behavior that mimics what a mother does will not make her a mother. Okay? Now, a mother, okay, by nature of her being a mother, will behave in a way that reflects motherhood. Feeding, sleeping, taking care of, and protecting, all these things. See the difference? The difference here is that behaviors don't make the person, okay? Just like a babysitter will never, just because the babysitter, she might do everything that a mother does, will never be the mother of that child, okay? So just because we behave, or we think this behavior is what Catholics do, that will not make us a good Catholic. We are a good Catholic because we know we're a child of God and will behave that way. It's the opposite, okay? And so a lot of times our fear is based off of, am I behaving the way that a good Catholic is? And that might be based off of what other people are doing, which is peer pressure, or it might be based off of whatever it is, okay? Maybe a fake persona, because in my Catholic friends, I have to behave this way, but no, I can act this way in other areas. And so we can't do that, okay? We have to be genuine, and we have to understand that faith comes from us. Fear is, I've seen fear being used in the Catholic context as well to prevent them from doing anything, okay? In doing that. In fact, I've seen people who are actually afraid but use humility as a shield, okay, for that. I don't know how many people say, well, I would have done this, but that's not what the Catholic Church wants me to do, because they're against that. And there's legitimate fear, but there's also false humility that kind of tries to hide that fear, okay? Fake Catholic syndrome, number 7. This is when you're zealous for the faith and you create this fake personality of holiness and intelligence. There's this idea that, I act very holy and zealous on one side, but then but with my other friends, I'm this crazy person. Now, we're not, I'm not here talking about people who fall, okay, or create personal sin. We all have to struggle with our sins, okay? I'm just talking about people who really, really are fake Catholics, who try to look all holy and and intelligent in front of their religious friends, but in reality, they're really living kind of like a double life. Okay, so I don't want to confuse that with the idea that we are sinful people and sometimes we do commit sin in this journey of perfection. Okay, number 8. Lack of self-reflection and belief versus ritualistic view of being Catholic. Okay? A lot of times, a lot of Catholics do not do self-reflection. Okay? They do not do self-reflection. They become ritualistic in being Catholic. They just, it's the car wash mentality where you go to the car wash, I get clean, I move out. Rather than really self-reflecting, Then the first thing as a self-reflection is this fundamental question, which is, who am I? Who am I? Am I, this is so basic and fundamental, okay, on that aspect. And I think a lot of times we don't spend a lot of time on that question because we're so focused on the theological aspects of God. What's the purpose of life? To know, love, and serve God, right? Rather than we're starting with the basics, which is, who am I? Okay? Who am I? And so because we are so caught up in the ritualistic part of being a Catholic, the Christmas, the Easter, the Advent, the Lent, the Ash Wednesday, and going to confession, doing the rosary, and all the other stuff, all this ritualistic stuff, which is important, but it's more important that we reflect who we are and we understand why we're doing these rituals rather than just doing the rituals thinking that's what we do, right? So it begins with that fundamental question, who am I? Am I, am I a child of God? Do I really believe I'm a child of God? Do I embrace that? And what does that mean? So we have to be more self-reflective, reflect on ourselves, okay? We have to have more intentional living. A lot of us, we just go day by day, and the world gives us how can I say this? The schedule. The world gives us the schedule. All right. Whether good or bad, Sunday mass, wake up, go to work, and that's not intentional living. That's robotic living. All right. Intentional living. Once you do intentional living, you will control the world. Right now, if you're living in a robotic, non-self-reflective world, the world is taking over, okay? And I can tell you that. So intentional living will say, okay, I'm going to create a schedule that I can live on. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just ignore the world completely, but there's a lot of things you can do that it promotes good saintly behavior by intentional living and growing saintly, okay? So by self-reflection, you can say, who am I? And then you can then discern how I intentionally want to live. I want to be a saint. That's what St. Therese said, okay? Because she knew, who am I? I'm a child of God. And what do I want to be? I want to be a saint. And so from that point on, she intentionally lived a life of a saint. That's what a story of a soul is all about. Okay, number 9, our overemphasis on no rather than yes. Okay? This is really big. So many times, we think that Catholicism is about no's. Okay, no. Okay? You cannot have children grow up in a life of no's. Okay? It's just impossible. All right? No, the problem with no's is that it's restrictive and it makes people placid, it makes people worried, and it doesn't allow them to shoot to what they need to be. Okay? So let me give you an example. I can tell people all the no's in the world, the 10 commandments. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do this. No, 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 right? A series of all these no's. But the problem with that is the person doesn't know how to grow in holiness, and most likely is going to feel like they're trapped, okay? And the third is that Satan is going to always play whack-a-mole with them, right? They're going to say, can I do this? No. Can I do that? And Satan's going to keep doing things until they're worn out to death, right? But if you tell them the yes, which is, I want you to be a saint, okay? And show them what they can do, what they should do, okay? They can be a champion and focus of good, right? If I enforce the 10 commandments in my household, do you think my household would be loving? And the answer is no. Okay? I can not lie. My children cannot lie to each other. They could not hurt each other. But do they love each other if they just follow the 10 commandments? No. And that's why Jesus gave us the Beatitudes. Because the Beatitudes are not the no's. The Beatitudes are the yeses, what we can do, what we should be striving for, what we should be doing. So it's great, and this is why, I started out with a story about that, my recruit friend, why it was important for him, for me, because I just thought being a Marine was just behaving this way, rather than being genuine in who you are and having the freedom to do what you want to do. And that freedom creates fearlessness that allows you to shoot for something great. And so don't worry about the no's. Focus on the yeses. And yes, will you fall when you focus on the yeses? Sure, you will. But you will also grow when you focus on those, okay? So focus on the Beatitudes. And here's the neat thing. If you focus on the Beatitudes, then the no's become just, they fall in line. Because you cannot contradict the Beatitudes with the 10 Commandments. Okay? All right? That would be like, going to the doctors and the doctor is saying, oh, you know what? You have diabetes. And the doctor just said, don't eat spaghetti, don't eat any pasta, don't eat any carbs, don't eat any sugar, okay? And that's it. Now, I walk out of the office, and he's going, so what can I do, okay? As opposed to if the doctor says, you know what, I want you to eat more protein, I want you to eat more fiber, I want you to eat more vegetables, I want you, now he's telling me what to do. By nature of me increasing my diet of vegetables and of meat, it would eliminate pasta and everything else, right? So emphasizing on the positives and what we can do is a lot more important than emphasizing the no, okay? So lastly, what causes fake and poor self-esteem is chasing after our passion rather than our intelligence, okay? A lot of times, the road to perfection is really managing our passions, okay, and our exterior senses. One of the things that I would show and demonstrate about that is our intellect and will are like a horseman, okay? The horseman is like the intellect and the will. And the horse is like our passions and our external senses and our passions are like the horse, okay? And so sometimes our horses are bucking around like that bronco-busting cowboy, and we need to manage that because our passion wants to do something, but we need to control it. But what happens a lot of times is that we don't control it, and then the horse goes out of control, right? Or maybe the horse is dead, and we should be kind of kicking it a little bit to get it moving, right? But when the horse rider can gracefully control the horse, or I should say govern the horse. All right? And horse and rider act like one. You have a beautiful, almost like a dance you can do with horses. You'd be amazed what horse riders can do with horses when they can kind of control the horse or govern the horse and their passions. So what we do is a lot of times we just let the passions go. I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. If I'm tired, this is why the Catholic Church does, have times of fasting and abstinence, because it's there to help us control our passions and our external senses. And because if we don't control those, then again, we become mislead. We become, it gets us in trouble, which brings us into a really bad self-esteem. Okay, a woman who can't control her passions might, chase after a man that is really not good for her. Okay, a man. A married man with a family chasing after his passions might be going after one job after another, or trying to find that job that makes him happy, and it never does. And meanwhile, that family has to suffer through another loss of a job and another loss of job and a loss of income and moving all over the place. No. Okay. So chasing after our passions rather than our intelligence. God gave us an intellect and a will to help us, guide us. So the importance here is that as Catholics, we have to go beyond just the sound bites of what it means to be a Catholic. We have to fully understand who we are, which we are a child of God, and then have an intentional living that progresses us to become the full-grown saintly person who uses their talents to glorify God. That's the epitome of a great saint. And you can do that. Anyone can do it. No matter what age you're at, you have to start now. That's why God gave us an intellect and a will. An intellect to contemplate, meditate, and think about who we are and about the intentional living, and then using the will to execute that intentional living. So this ends this episode, and let's end it with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, help us to understand and meditate on who we are. We are a child of God, not because of what we did, but because of everything that you did, dying on the cross to provide the sacraments that we may become truly a child of God. May we understand that. May we then intentionally meditate on what you want us to do your will, and to grow in that will, so that we may glorify you and live eternally with you in heaven and with Our Lady, our Mother, Mary. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Suess, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect. Who am I? Who do I want to be? Or am I pretending to be something that I'm not? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com. Join me next week as we discuss the topic of loving our neighbor with true love.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom